Welcome back. Today we're going to focus on functions. Functions enable us to simplify our code, especially when we want to repeat the same set of operations multiple times. To start, let's consider this code, which helps us to create the video shown here on the right. In this animation, we create two soccer balls, and then, instead of for loop, have these soccer balls move through a set of points. See these two pieces of code here? They do almost exactly the same thing. They both create a soccer ball and set the points it will cycle through using two values, P1 and P2. The only difference between these two blocks of code is P1 and P2. And these two blocks also look very similar as well. They both set the new position for the soccer ball with each step in the animation. Now, overall, maybe this code isn't so bad. This code isn't too long, so it isn't too hard to manage. However, if you want to do something similar to 4 soccer balls, it would be much more difficult. And then after that, what if you wanted to be able to easily change properties of soccer balls without having to do it 4 separate times? As I'm sure you've guessed by now, functions are exactly what we need to solve these issues. So what exactly is a function? We've already seen a couple actually, namely the range and the length functions. As you saw with these functions are something that have predefined behavior. This is done by passing inputs into the function and then using the output they pass back, if there is an output. As an example, we see here on the right one example use of the range function, where we pass it the numbers 2 and 5, making these our inputs, and then get a list 2, 3, 4 as output. So functions are great and all, but how exactly does this help us with the code I just showed you? Well, we can actually create our own functions. So this is the syntax for how to do it. You start with def, then your function name, and then, in parentheses, the variables you need in order to perform the operation. Then, you add the code you want to be part of your function. And lastly, if needed, you return any important variables you created within this function. Otherwise, any variables you create are lost, so just keep that in mind. Some functions return one or more variables, and others don't return anything. So let's see a few quick examples of this before returning to our soccer ball example. First, let's look at a basic function. So here, you can see we define a new function called myFunction. It takes in a single input and then prints it. Below you can see an example use where we pass in hello world. Notice both how we define our function and how we use it, because the syntax is important. Next, let's look at a function that performs some kind of operation. So here we define another function called addNumbers and set it to accept 2 inputs. This function adds the 2 inputs together and returns a result. As our example use, we pass in 2 and 3 and get the number 5 in return. Alright, let's look at one more example before returning to our soccer ball example. Here we define a function called drawCircle that takes in 3 inputs, one for the width of the circle and then 2 more for the position of the circle, x and y. Notice here the order of the inputs will matter, so be very careful when defining and using functions with more than one input. As an example use of this function, we show below using it 4 separate times to draw 4 different circles. You can see here on the right, each of these are drawn using the different settings we passed into the function. Alright, now it's time to return to our soccer ball example. Looking back at the code we saw at the beginning of our lesson today, we see 2 potential functions. First, we see these blocks of code that are very similar. The only difference is P1 and P2. So let's address this first. Pause here if needed and think about the following. How should we define our function? What should be our function inputs? And what, if any, variables should be returned from our function? This is the way I decided to write this function. Remember, code can be written in many ways to perform the same job, so if this doesn't match what you had in mind, try out your idea in the playground and see if it works. The way I did it requires 2 inputs, P1 and P2, and use these to create our ball and set of points it should pass through, and then returns 2 variables, which are now named ball and points. Notice here that in order to return more than one value, we want to separate our variables using a comma. You can choose to surround these variables with parentheses, as I did here, but this isn't required. Below this function, you can see how we use it. We input 2 numbers for P1 and P2, then assign 2 different variables, ball1 and ball1 points, to store the ones returned from the function. So the variable ball returned from the function is stored in ball1, and the variable points from the function is stored in ball1 points. We can then repeat this for our second soccer ball, as shown here. You can see we changed our P1 and P2 values and store the variables returned from the function in ball2 and ball2 points. Next, let's look at these pieces of code, outlined in green here at the bottom. These are also repeated for each soccer ball. So how do we define a function to replace these lines? What would be our inputs? What would be our outputs, if any? Pause here again and think about it for a bit. Here's how I chose to write our second function. This one takes in two variables, which we'll call ball and p. Note here, p has to be a list with an x and y position. We then use the x and y position in p to set the x and y position of the ball. And we don't need to return anything here. Below, we see how we're using this function. We pass in the soccer ball whose position we want to change, as well as the set of points we want to use for this. Again, we repeat this for our second soccer ball. Alright, now I don't see anything we need to change to simplify this code further. So now let's try adding in two additional soccer balls. This is what that would look like. I'm just showing the pieces of code that change, not the functions we defined. But keep in mind that those functions are still part of this code and they are the same as before. So we see here, we only had to add two additional lines per soccer ball, one to create the ball and one to change its position during the animation. As you can see, this made adding those soccer balls much easier than it would have been if we hadn't written our own functions. Now, one of the advantages of using functions is the ability to change all our soccer balls in one place. For example, if I instead wanted all the soccer balls to have a width of 15 instead of 30, I simply change our soccer ball function here. If we hadn't used a function, we would have had to change these values in 4 different places, or even more if we had more soccer balls. So we can see here how much using functions can really simplify our code in this kind of situation. Next, what if we wanted to change the color of the soccer balls, but not have all of them be the same color? We can then add a third variable, called color, to our function, and instead of making every soccer ball black, we'll use the input color value to set the color of the soccer ball. Below, in our code, we would account for this by passing in a color for each soccer ball. Here, I use black, red, blue, and aquamarine, and you can see the difference in our animation. Next, let's consider one more scenario. What if we don't want to have to pass in the color value every single time? What if we would like all soccer balls to be black except when specifically desired to be another color? We can use optional inputs to do this. So this is how we would use the optional argument. We still have our third input variable be a color, but now add this equals black statement to show this color will be set to black except when specifically changed to something else. Below, you can see how this changes our code. For the soccer ball we want to keep black, we don't have to pass in a color. For the others where we did want another color, we pass in the color value this way, using the color equals sign and then our color value. Alright, the soccer ball example is in the playground in case you want to try making other modifications and test how different things work out. Test out some things, and when you're ready, we'll move on to our next lesson.